Abdullah. Thank you very much, sir, and very warm welcome to you. The panel discussion is titled G20 and the Global South, New Formats for Cooperation on SDGs. And as I call out the names of the panelists, I request them to please come onto stage. The speakers are Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs from South Africa. G.A. Tadders, the Welk Visiting Fellow, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS. Famida Khatun, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. Fabio Veras Soares, Head of International Policy Center for Inclusive Development, Institute of Applied Economic Research, Brazil. And moderating the session is Axel Berger, the Deputy Director Interim for the German Institute of Development and Sustainability and Managing Director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Germany. Over to you, Axel.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And a warm welcome to this panel, to this opening panel on, perhaps one of the key, if not the key issues, how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And so this panel is titled G20 and the Global South, New Formats for Cooperation on SDGs. I do not have to introduce myself, and the panelists have already been introduced, so this gives us a little bit more time for our substantive discussion. Let me start with a couple of introductory notes and remarks. We have the Agenda 2030. It has been adopted in 2015, so we're at the half time, you might say, but we are certainly not on a halfway to achieving the SDGs. We have a SDG summit coming up, high-level summit in September this year in New York, so it's really high time to reflect on what can be, what should be done to achieve the SDGs. Unfortunately, we see a regression in terms of achieving the SDGs, at least since 2 years. If you look at the SDG index and other indicators, we have a polycrisis with wars, with food insecurity, with climate change, pandemics. But it's not only this polycrisis that hinders us to achieve the SDGs. It's something more fundamental. The way we conceptualize, the way we prioritize, the way we finance the SDGs, or the systemic transformation. Here we really have to focus on. Urgent actions needed. We need to focus on off-track areas. We need to identify key transformative interventions in order to make progress on the SDGs. More fundamentally, we need to reflect on the international system that fosters or fails to foster the achievement of the SDGs. Obviously, we are observing reform debates on the World Bank, in the World Trade Organization. We need we see the establishment of new institutions, the AIIB, the New Development Bank. All of this is happening in an increasingly contested geopolitical environment. So, with this background in mind, what should the G20 do? I mean, looking back to the Indonesian presidency, to a couple of years more, we see that the SDGs are kind of the glue that held the G20 together in these very difficult times. So we see a strong emphasis on the SDGs in the Indonesian G20 communique, for example. Building on this consensus, what can the 4 presidencies of the Global South, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, what can they achieve in order to foster a really cooperative environment for systemic transformations towards sustainability? And I'm very pleased that we have an excellent panel today to reflect on these questions, to reflect on the challenges of emerging markets, to reflect on the data requirements. What do we need to measure and to prioritize SDG achievement? What are the financial needs that we need to keep in mind? So as we already heard, or as the panelists have already been introduced, I do not have to do that. So let me immediately hand over to Elizabeth to kickstart the first round of interventions on the panel. We will have a second round, and then hopefully we will also have the chance to involve you, dear audience, into our conversation. Elizabeth, please.
Great, thank you, Axel. And it's very apposite that we have this ticking clock there in front of us, both to keep us to time, but also to remember, to remind us that time is running out. I want to, in the interest of time, just highlight 2 or 3 points, which are by no means comprehensive, but I understand that the rest of my colleagues will do the rest of the heavy lifting. I think just as a point of departure, I think it is important that in the current geopolitical context, in the current developmental crisis that we're in, we need to shift our mindsets about what we understand as appropriate rules and regulations for all manner of things, from intellectual property rights to debt, to how you finance things. It does require a global paradigm shift. What do we understand by global public goods? Okay, and I think some of the points around what India has done on digital public goods, I think, is important. So that's just by way of introduction. First important point I want to make is that when we talk about SDGs and whether we're going to achieve them or not, we need to be able to have the data to assess our progress. And one of the biggest challenges that many developing countries, but I'm going to focus here specifically on the continent on Africa have, yes, is that lack of data sets across all indicators of the SDGs. And so in the latest report by the UN Economic Commission for Africa, it highlights that there are 120 indicators for which there is insufficient data in Africa to be able to assess whether there is progress or not. And the most significant gaps are SDGs 5, which is women, gender, 11, which I think is cities, 12, 14, 16, 17, and 16 being governance and being a critical dimension of, for Africa, I think is significant. So that's the first point. We really, if we're going to accelerate the SDGs, we need to be able to see that we're accelerating the SDGs. So we need to do something about data. The second point I want to make, and this is in no particular order, is really around debt. And this is specifically looking at what the G20 can do in this regard. You know, there's been a lot of focus in the discussions around debt, and the G20 has certainly taken a lead role in that, around the role of non-traditional public lenders. But I would say really the big elephant in the room that we really need to grapple with, and this is about the paradigm shift, is what are we going to do with private creditors? 40% of African debt owed is to private creditors. The existing G20 common framework is moving very, very slowly. It excludes private creditors. We really need to rethink the rules around how we do debt. We delay debt servicing, we restructure debt, and so on. One of the ideas that we've been discussing in some of the forums I've participated in relate to introducing, for example, mandatory debt suspension trigger clauses in crises like a climate emergency, like a pandemic shock that would immediately kick in for both public and private lenders. So that's just one idea. We also need to rethink what we mean by vulnerability, the definitions of vulnerability. At the moment, in terms of concessional finance and access to grants, we're looking at it in the context of low income, lower middle income, etc. Vulnerabilities in this moment of poly-crisis have taken on a different hue, and it is also about the debate around beyond GDP, which is also an issue that we have discussed in this context as well. The third point I want to make relates again to finance, but an issue that African states have really taken to heart, which is about illicit financial flows. The big issue here is not about how African states stop illicit financial flows, which annually amount to about $89 billion out of Africa, which is more than we get in ODA. But it's really about how we tackle tax havens, issues of corporate trade mispricing and so on. And a lot of that actually sits with the way in which the regulations are made, particularly in the global north. And so I'm going to stop there. I have another point, but I'm going to make that later.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. 4 really important points that we may want to consider in our follow-up discussion. And I like in particular your emphasis on the private creditors, because that's also something we very much highlighted in our Think 7 process, because it's the responsibility of the G7 to get to get answers on that challenge. So thanks very much for these 4 points. Taras, shall we continue with your first intervention?
Thank you, Axel, and thank you G20 for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. I will try to avoid overlapping with what Elizabeth has just shared with all of us. It is, well acknowledged and recognized that we are lagging behind in SDGs. Although there was some progress till the COVID year, but post-COVID we are backsliding on many SDGs, which is a matter of concern. And now that we have already passed about 8 years, 2015, and we are just 7 years left, there have been doubts raised whether we'll be able to achieve the agenda by 2030. But I think that's not the way we should be looking at approaching the SDGs. It is essential that we need to raise resources, we need to put in efforts, collective efforts, collaborations, to see that we are able to accelerate the pace of achieving SDGs. In fact, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network reports have indicated that there is a very close association between the SDG progress and the well-being. And if the ultimate objective of the global community is to achieve progress in well-being, then I think it is essential that we focus on SDGs. Now that said for the beginning, how do we do that? Now, as Elizabeth was mentioning, that there are issues of debt crisis for many less developed countries and even the developing countries. Now, this has squeezed the fiscal space available for many developing countries. The revenues, the government revenues available for augmenting the resources for SDGs are virtually not there in most developing countries. And in fact, if you see post-COVID, the available finance for SDGs has gone down by nearly about $1 trillion from about nearly 4.8 trillion before to about 3.6 trillion post-COVID. Now, how do we bridge this gap? Now, again, Elizabeth was mentioning about multilateral development banks, development assistance committee members, increasing the assistance to the developing countries. This is at the north-south point of view. I think, it is time that we look within South, the South-South cooperation, the global South. What is that we as a developing country together do to augment resources within, so that we are able to complement the resources that are made available from multilateral development banks, DAC member countries. Now, in that context, I would like to suggest 2-3 options available. That we have regional development banks, like we have New Development Bank, we have AIIB. In addition to that, at every national level, we need to have national development banks which take care of the requirements of SDG financing within their countries, which unfortunately is not available in most of the developing countries. I think it is here that we need to focus on this area. The second is that how we augment resources of the government so that additional funds are made available to the SDG financing. Is it possible that we align the national budgeting to the SDG financing? This is, I think, one way all the developing countries can look to. The third is that SDGs is becoming more achievable if local participation is there. So we need to look at what the local governments, the subnational governments, and the local communities do together, so that there is a focus, there is a rigorous efforts put in by them, because they know what is priority for them, They can decide the priorities. They can also find out the options available. So this is the way we can complement the resources available globally. Yeah, sorry. So I stop here, and maybe next round I will.
Thank you very much, Tadas, especially for putting the focus also on the issue of domestic resource mobilization, which is also very key. Shall we continue with your intervention? Famida, please.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. So I think the two speakers, what they have already spoken, some of the points which I'll dwell on will echo their points as well. The SDGs are falling behind. We are falling behind in terms of achieving SDGs. We are talking about poverty level, health, education, and many others. But I think another important SDG, which is SDG 17, that is partnership and means of implementation, we are seriously lacking behind. And because of that, all the other LDCs are being affected. So when you talk about means of implementation, we talk about finance, we talk about technology, we talk about capacity. The finance issue has been already highlighted, but I also want to take a little bit forward that you know that the independent review of MD-based capital adequacy framework, which has been the report of the G20, that has quite eloquently mentioned 5 recommendations how to improve the adequacy of the capital, because we are talking about that, about the adequacy of finance, and we heard from the speaker of the inaugural session, Sherpa, he has mentioned that there's no dearth of finance. The only thing is that the distribution of the funds and channeling the funds, and also in terms of not only channeling, but also the efficiency of the institutions itself. We have seen that the progress which have been made over the years, that has been fundamentally flawed, and that's why when there was pandemic and then followed by war, some of the countries have fallen further behind, which means that the progress was not sustainable and inclusive. And that is also, has also led to the debt sustainability issue, that, increased debt issues. Over the last 10 years, for example, between 2010 and 2021, all the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, and North America, their debt sustainability, debt to GDP ratio has doubled. In Asia, South Asia, it has increased by 2%, much better than others, but we also know that there are some countries which are more vulnerable than the others in Asia. So this is a time when this issue has to be addressed, and then the financial system has to be really reformed and made strengthened, because we have heard that the challenges, the nature, extent, scale of challenges has really changed. And that's why an institution or the whole multilateral development banks or the financial system, which has been made, developed in the 20th century, they cannot address the 21st century challenges. So in order to address the 21st century challenges, all these Bretton Woods organizations, IMF, World Bank, WTO, and new financial institutions, they have to really make, reform themselves. And when we talk about reforming, the efficiency of these institutions itself is very important, because what we have seen that the cost of fund, the processing period, they are so lengthy and cumbersome that the recipient countries don't really feel encouraged to go for these loans or funding. That is one. The other thing is that sometimes, most of the times we have seen that the issues like SDGs or climate finance, these go as an add-on issue to the program, country-level program. They're not integrated, and they're not aligned with the priorities of the countries themselves. One reason is that, of course, that many countries do not have the internal capacity, and that's why whatever comes from the head offices at the national level, the country level, those are followed. And these are just add-on, and then once the project is complete it, and that's it, the end of the thing. So it doesn't have any impact, long-lasting impact. So that the way of working, the modality, that has to be really changed. And also the other thing, the coordination among and between the organizations themselves. There are a lot of overlapping, inefficiency, and also, I think, competition within the organizations themselves, which is also important because it leads to wastage of resources. Because same resources, or a lot of resources are working at, centered around only a few couple of issues, which is not the most efficient way. So the reform issue has to really come in a big way. So I have a few recommendations. Maybe in my next part I will come to that.
Famida, many thanks for putting all those topics on our table. I would in particular be interested in your view on this suggestion that the IFIs, that the World Bank should focus more on the funding of global public goods, but perhaps you pick that up in your second intervention. Fabio, shall we continue with your intervention, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Axel. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. So many of the things I was going to talk about have been already touched. Then I'm going just to highlight some of the things that I do think it's very important. So for the introduction that Axel gave us, it's pretty clear that we are living in a polycrisis world. And that makes it very difficult to accelerate SDGs, which is actually the topic of a task force led by Tadas. And on that angle, I would highlight two aspects. One, the economic aspect, the current crisis that we are in, that it makes much more difficult for governments and society at large to do the type of investment that's necessary to finance the transition, not only to achieve the Paris Agreement, but also the SDGs. And the other aspect that perhaps it's even more difficult is the high level of polarization within societies and across the world in a geopolitical setting. And why that's very challenging? That's very challenging because it's not only the lack of investments, but also the lack of consensus, both in national and international arena, to agree on what should be the priorities to achieve both goals, the climate goals and also the SDG goals, and how they could feed into each other. That's particularly important because some of the reforms that we are putting forward and within T20 we are recommending to the governments, they can be, they have costs, and these costs can fragment society even more. So yesterday, during Dr. Park's presentation in the ADBI parallel side event, we saw this, the need that we have to make it more expensive or to give less incentive to high carbon activities, and at the same time incentivize low carbon activities. And that thing, when we implement in terms of policies, has costs that are heterogeneous within society. So how you build consensus, how you raise revenues to finance mitigation measures so that we don't have escalation in terms of people getting poorer or blocking the reforms that are necessary. So I do think that these are things that are very important. The other aspect is actually something that Elizabeth has raised, is the lack of data. So even in Latin America, for example, there's a recent report from ECLAC that shows that we only have data for 66% of the SDG indicators that we could monitor. That's up from 20%, so we have made some progress, but most of the missing indicators are related to environment and to governance. So basically, the two challenging issues that we have. So we are not able even to have this dashboard to measure our progress. So I do think that we should have more cooperation. So going back to the SDG 11, that 17 that has been mentioned, not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of how we can get this data, how we can use technology to produce this data, and how we can track the progress. And I think that the T20 is a good environment to discuss this, how we produce the missing data and how we use this data in a way that we could inform policy and also the progress towards the SDGs. Thank you.
Fabio, many thanks for highlighting again the importance of data. Okay, in the first round, we talked about data, we talked about finance, international finance, domestic resource mobilization. I think there are a couple of issues left we need to discuss. But looking at the watch, I would, in the second round, I would really ask you to focus your intervention so that we have a little bit of time for the audience left to intervene as well. Elizabeth, what we haven't discussed is the issue of peace and security. I mean, there are wars, many wars currently going on. We have political polarization in many societies. What about this with regard to the SDGs?
Yes, in fact, in response to your specific question, I just want to highlight the point that Ambassador Chinoy made yesterday, where he emphasized, that's why you also head up the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, the importance of peace and security. And I think if we look at the continent, at the African continent, over the last few years, there has been some significant regression in terms of conflict. You know, if you just think across the Sahel, what is happening in the Sahel at the moment, I mean, how do you get data, and how do you actually execute policies? If policies exist, how do you execute them? And here I think there are two components. The one component is, what do we do internally, domestically, in our countries to ensure that there's greater accountability, transparency, good governance? Because a lot of these conflicts, to some extent, are fueled by local grievance. If you look at what's happening in northern Mozambique, it's seen as a jihadist insurgency, but it's built on local grievance. So that's clearly one dimension, and that's something that African states have to deal with. The second dimension, of course, is that it has been stirred and exacerbated by the way in which certain external actors operate. And I think that's an important point also for many G20 countries to reflect on, because some of them are actors in those localities and they take different sides. And that certainly doesn't help the situation. And so for me, if we're talking about accelerating SDGs, we talk about all of these things, and I've highlighted some very critical issues at the beginning, but if we actually don't get our peace and security and governance right, it's not gonna help.
That's the basis of achieving the SDGs. I totally agree. Tadas, what about the way we consume, the way we produce? How does this affect the SDGs? I believe that that's something that is very much high on the agenda of the G20 President of India. So may I invite you to briefly elaborate on that?
Thank you, Alex, for raising a very important aspect. In fact, in all the SDGs, SDG 1 to 6 are, of course, very important or basic to improving the poverty levels, reducing the poverty levels, improving health, education, and all. But of all, I think the very closely associated with all of these SDGs is SDG 12, which talks about sustainable consumption and sustainable production. If you look at the Indian G20 presidency, the focus has been on lifestyle for environment, which we call as LIFE. Now, while the focus has been on the consumption patterns, sustainable consumption patterns, now whether can we think of sustainable production processes which complement sustainable consumption patterns. I think we need to have a balance between sustainable consumption as also sustainable production processes. It's not enough to focus on only the lifestyles. It is also necessary that we focus on production processes, sectors which complement the lifestyles that are sustainable ecologically and environmentally, and which will also contribute to the SDG 13, which is about the climate. I think not much is discussed or thought about in regard to how we plan production processes, systems, which will create an enabling environment for enterprises, which it may be social enterprises, it may be for benefit enterprises. If they want to enter into these sectors, which are eco-friendly and environment-friendly, and also inclusive, socially inclusive, and create employment opportunities, it is time that we create incentives, we create policy framework, and ecosystem which is favoring this kind of sustainable consumption and production styles. I think that this is an area which needs to be focused now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tadas. Famida, how can we fix the international development finance system? You've mentioned that you have a couple of recommendations. What are the key recommendations from your side?
Not couple of 2-3 recommendations, and what I have just spoken in my first intervention, taking cue from that. One is that there needs to be a substantive increase in concessional finance for development and global public good. This is first, number one. The second one is about partnership. Financing model which takes into account the partnership. It's not just the top-down approach, but also taking the participants, the participant country in the whole process in designing and implementing activities. So a financing model, they prioritize a partnership approach and enhance voices and representation. And my third recommendation is an enhanced global safety net to secure debt sustainability and crisis response. As I have mentioned regarding the debt GDP ratio which has increased, so an increased fund for taking care of debt sustainability, and which is possible given the amount of resources which are available. These are specific to the funding issue, but this other issue which I did not have time to dwell on, I'll just touch upon that, is about the technology. So when you talk about technology transfer, it's not only about the instrument or the equipment. Along with the equipment, the skills and knowledge has to be attached to that. Many countries of the global south, they do not have the know-how of using that technology. So it has to be a combination of both technology and knowledge. And my final point is that the world now, given that we have gone through and going through the crisis, which are, and the nature of the crisis is both short-term and long-term. So that's why the whole system, the institutional system, the financial system, and also the global political system has to be prepared in such a way that it can address the short-term crisis, at the same time to be prepared for the longer term. And when you talk about crisis like climate change, this is one part of the problem, but also we have to take into account that when you talk about development and growth, it has to be wholesome development and growth. We take into the climate crisis as an ongoing, and it's going to, I don't know when we can overcome that challenge. It is an ongoing challenge. We have to take care of that. But while doing that, we should not also forget about the issue of poverty reduction, inequality reduction, and also other social issues like health, education, and gender empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fabio, may I invite you to elaborate a little bit more on the importance of data for our policy making to achieve the SDGs, please?
Okay, thank you. Another aspect, besides mentioning the missing data for the SDG dashboards, the other aspect is how this data actually trickles down into the policy making to inform the design of policy and also to inform the monitoring and evaluation, not of the SDGs as an outcome, but actually as the policy that's going to contribute, or the program that's going to contribute to that outcome. And for that, it's quite important also that the SDGs are embedded into the planning of the governments. So we heard from the Sherpa in the very beginning, in the opening speech, that the countries adhere to the SDGs. So the SDGs are part of the country policy process. So it needs to be internalized. So just to cite again this recent ECLAC report, very few countries in Latin America have actually incorporated the SDGs as part of the policy and planning process in the mid to long term. The ones that have done that with the Caribbean ones, that it's not a coincidence, are those that are mostly threatened by climate change and other multiple crises that we have seen recently, including the issue of food security. So it's quite important. And as T20 for us, data is essential. Our policy recommendation needs to be evidence-based. So we do need to foster governments and the society to produce good data, and we should support them with good analysis and recommendations that come out of this analysis. Thank you.
So thank you very much to the four of you. I've been informed by the organizers that we really should close our panel now. Perhaps that was the intention of putting a German here on the moderator seat, right? So thank you very much for putting all those important topics on our table. The SDGs are cross-cutting, they are mainstream, they are the key topics, so I hope that subsequent panels will pick up some of these topics, and obviously we can, or we are looking forward to exchange with you during coffee discussions on the other panel on the importance of the SDG and what can be done to accelerate SDG achievement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel. May I request